Sorry about that. It just went offline. Good evening, dear friends. We've all gathered here today in honor of the memory of Mr. Keshav Desiraju, who sadly left us a few weeks ago. Keshav was a great friend of many of us at INTACH Chennai chapter and a well-wisher of the organization. Keshav had an illustrious career with the Indian Administrative Service. He was Secretary, Health and Family Welfare to the Government of India, and he retired as Secretary, Department of Consumer Affairs. After retirement, he continued to remain engaged with issues of public health, particularly mental health and primary health care. He served on the board of several non-profit organizations in the sector. As with many organizations, INTACH Chennai Chapter 2 was the beneficiary of his kindness. About 5 years ago, INTACH had initiated a series of talks titled Those Were the Days, in an attempt to recall the fading memory of the idealism and optimism of the post-independence years and to introduce to the younger people the aspirations and hopes of some of the leading lights of that period. Keshav was enthusiastic about the concept of the series and spontaneously accepted our suggestion to give a talk on the life and times of Dr. Sarvapalli Gopal, a man who contributed greatly to the intellectual climate of independent India. This was only the start of Keshav's interaction with Chennai chapter. He attended our walks and talks, and to us at INTACH Chennai chapter, he was a friend and supporter. In fact, our last two programs came out of the ideation and discussions with him. We had spoken to him recently of a talk on his book, Of Gifted Voice, on M.S. Subbalakshmi for the chapter. But alas, that was not to ever be. Keshav delivered this excellent talk in January 2017 during India's 70th year of independence on Dr. Sarvapalli Gopal. Dr. Gopal, 1923 to 2002, historian and biographer, belonged to a generation which came of age as India achieved independence in 1947. While India's problems were many, India was then a beacon of the developing world, as witnessed by several world leaders who came to see its new industries and growth. More importantly, India was a leader to the colonized countries of Asia and Africa, and even to the Caribbean countries who hoped to follow her footsteps to achieve their own freedom from colonial yokes. As India now marches towards its 75th year of independence, we find that this talk is even more relevant today and needs to reach a wider audience. Hopefully, more young people and others in Chennai and elsewhere will be able, through technology, to listen and learn from this talk, which will be played after the observations by Mr. N.Ram. Chennai chapter thanks Mr. N.Ram, who will introduce Keshav's talk and its relevance in today's context. Mr. Ram was close to Dr. Gopal and knew Keshav well too. N.Ram, former editor-in-chief of The Hindu and Frontline, known for his investigative journalism, is a co-biographer of the great writer R.K. Narayan. Among the many honors and awards he has received are the Padma Bhushan and the Sri Lanka Ratna. Thank you, Mr. Ram, for being here. Farewell, Keshav, dear friend. You will be greatly missed. Over to you, Mr. Ram.
Sorry, I just unmuted. This event is titled Tribute to a Friend and Well-Wisher, Keshav Desiraju. by the Chennai chapter of the Indian National Trust for Arts and Cultural Heritage, or INTACH. And I'm grateful to have an opportunity to say a few words at this event. Keshav Desiraju died as he lived, passing away unexpectedly, quietly, gracefully at the age of 66, while in apparent good health, without causing the least trouble to anyone, but leaving a deep imprint on everyone who knew him or encountered him in some way or another at some point in their lives. It was widely noted that few civil servants and intellectuals have been as spontaneously, as widely, and as sincerely mourned by their colleagues, peers, and civil society leaders and activists as Keshav was. I think this was essentially because they recognized something rare in him, a rare spirit, a highly intelligent and sensitive man of rare intellectual and personal integrity and moral independence. Keshav achieved a great deal on the ground by standing by his values and his well-considered views and what he believed was beneficial to society. This he did without making the slightest effort to draw attention or undue attention, if you like, to his own solid and exemplary contributions in the areas of mental health, education, consumer affairs, and perhaps also heritage. He had several other interests, in particular, as was well known among those who knew him, a passion for Carnatic music. His long-standing and close friends, among them Gopal Gandhi, Ramachandra Guha, and Sriram Panchu, have written or spoken movingly and eloquently about Keshav's gifts and traits. I didn't know him as long as they did or as well as they did, so I won't say more about Keshav except that we miss him very deeply. But this INTACH event is really about values and connecting different generations, and especially the current younger generation with these values. At least 3 generations are involved here. The generations represented by Sarvapalli Gopal, who lived between 1923 and 2002, as was mentioned. I knew him quite well, and in fact from the early 70s, particularly after the emergency, when he was in Jawaharlal Nehru University, and most closely when he retired to Chennai after he had retired from his professorship at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And of course, Keshav Desiraju's generation, 1955 to 2021, and the current younger generation, this event is meant to speak to primarily. But there is in the background, as you'll hear in the talk, yet another generation, the time of Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, the distinguished philosopher and president of India, whose life covered 1888 to 1975. I had the privilege of meeting him a few times in Girija, the house where he lived in the final years, through some family connections. Central to all this is what has been termed the idea of India as it took shape in the modern age. It took shape during the long struggle for independence and in the early years of free India. It was mostly a historically turbulent time. And the centerpiece of this event is a recorded talk, the recorded talk referred to by Sujata, to an audience, if I recollect rightly, to about 30 people by Keshav Desiraju. In fact, Tara, who was introducing that event, I recall, apologized for it. And Keshav said something like, no, that's not a problem. I've spoken to smaller audiences, but he was a little disappointed at that time that younger people had not shown enough interest and so on. But today, I hope this talk will reach a much wider audience now and perhaps when it's put up on YouTube or wherever. This is a little gem, this talk that INTACH has brought forward, I believe in an enhanced way with some technical improvements in audio and so on. is a little gem because it is an instructive, elegant, easy-flowing talk on the life and work of his uncle, the preeminent historian of modern India, Sarvepalli Gopal. We can say without exaggeration that Gopal was the father of contemporary history in India, because at that time, historians tended to look upon anyone dealing with the contemporary period. Gopal was also a major and very distinguished biographer, which we will hear about in the talk. He studied, lived and wrote and participated also in policy making in a quite substantial way during historically tumultuous times, globally and in India as well. As a historian, he was highly respected for his hard-to-match industry, his commitment to precision and detail, his reliance and mastery of documentary sources, his powers of interpretation, his elegant literary style, which held several surprises because that style, Gopal could also be sharp, and there were some edges in that style. Gopal ranged himself against the mundane, pedestrian, dense writing of history. He believed that fine, clear, evocative writing and style was an integral part of being a good historian, and this is often forgotten by contemporary historians. Some are very fine writers, but I think a great deal can be learned from Gopal's approach to style. Keshav, drawing partly from Srinath Raghavan's excellent introduction to this book, the collected essays, it's called Imperialists, Nationalists, Democrats, the collected essays edited by of Sarvepalli Gopal. Can you see it? I don't know the camera shows. In a very fine introduction, which Keshav draws upon, he calls attention to the three defining themes of Gopal's work as a modern historian of India. One is the empire, that is imperialist Britain's encounter with and subjugation of India. Two, the struggle for independence and the struggle for democracy. And three, the struggle for secularism, which Gopal interpreted in his own distinctive way. As a historian, policy formulator, public intellectual, and intensely private individual, and Keshav, you will hear soon, comments on that, Gopal lived and worked on his own terms. A tremendously principled man, quite spoken, with many interests, but on occasion asserting himself very strongly, even sharply, with some edge on issues that mattered to him. He was extremely well read in English literature, as Srinath Raghavan points out in this introduction, in history, in philosophy, even in Marxist and other left-leaning works. But he worked out his own path as a historian and developed his own distinctive worldview. And it is not easy to brand or label the framework within Gopal developed his professional contributions to history as well as to biography. Gopal was in some, Srinath Raghavan observes, and I quote here, unique in being the great liberal historian of modern India and arguably the finest. I have reservations about characterizing Gopal as liberal historian. Gopal was certainly no classic liberal, and he did not remain in one groove all his life as a historian. As he grew older, I believe he became more progressive, speaking up and writing in the cause of social and economic justice, sometimes even in a radical way. See his writings on the Babri Masjid, see how he moved against the emergency, passed a resolution in 1975 at the History Congress in Aligarh, and so on. And you will see this trajectory, which reflected his great intellectual and scholarly asset, his openness to a range of ideas, his willingness to listen to opposing schools of thought, and his commitment to forward-looking democratic principles. And Keshav's talk, this little gem, brings this out beautifully, I think, in the short time that was allotted to him there. Gopal, of course, had various interests. I knew him personally very well towards the end of his life also. And notable among this was his passion for cricket, which you'll be surprised to know he inherited from his father, watching cricket along with Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan and Voltaire when they were in Voltaire. Gopal loved literary cricket writing as much as cricket, especially Test cricket. In a delightful review article for Frontline in 1992, titled The Spell of Cricket, which is cited by Srinath Raghavan in his fine introduction, Gopal writes, and I think this is the essence of his love of cricket, and I quote, "To me, as no doubt to many others, the game and the English language have helped each other to increase the sum total of fascination. I still remember, for example, reading a long time ago a comment of Cardus, that is Neville Cardus, on Dulip Singh. This is what Cardus wrote, Gopal says here. It is one of the delights of an wrote Cardus of an English summer afternoon to watch Dulip's bat flash in the sun. That sentence, with all that it leaves unsaid, has haunted me through the years, writes Gopal. We know that Gopal would have responded to the current attacks on freedoms, including freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of creativity, and even the attack on secular, democratic, rights-bearing citizenship, and what needs to be done to find a way back to the core values shaped by our freedom struggle and set out in the preamble to our Constitution, namely justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Thank you, Sujata.
Apologize for the size of the audience.
Countries.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. And thank you so much for asking me to speak, particularly on this subject. You don't have to apologize for the size of the audience. And I've spoken to smaller numbers, so that's working. But then I'm very grateful to all of you who have taken the trouble to come. And when thinking about what I was going to say this evening, perhaps because of what I had said to me, I thought perhaps there would be more young people. Perhaps this is also, it's a lesson to all of us. But then speaking to people, shall we say, who are so young, has its own advantages because all of you can instinctively relate to the times at which I would like to speak. So again, Tara, thank you so much for asking me to come. I must also add here that I'm not a historian, as Gopal was, or an academic or a biographer, all of which he was. And I speak only as someone who for many years had glimpses into the private man. And as I said earlier, I was intrigued by the theme of this series of lectures of recollections of women and men of an earlier generation and of people who were young adults at the time of independence and for whom the idea of India was very precious. I should also add here, for those of you who are interested, that a very fine account of Sarvepalli Gopal's life and work can be found in the introductory essay by Professor Srinath Raghavan in a work which he edited called Imperialists, Nationalists, Democrats, collected essays of Sarvepalli Gopal in 2013. It's not easy to speak about a man as intensely personal as Sarvapalli Gopal. I think this was a contradiction in the man. He was known around the world in common rooms, in classrooms, in senate halls, in embassies, foreign offices, in grand reception halls. He was a brilliant conversationalist, and a much sought after public speaker. And in a pre-email era, he was a delightful correspondent. He was capable of great affection and even devotion, and had a strong notion of family. But in all his engagements, public and private, he gave only on his own terms and in his own time. The essential Gopal being never, if ever, relieved. Sarvapalli Gopal was born in Madras on 23rd April 1923, the sixth child and only son of Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and Talpuri Sivakam. It was not only that he was a son that marked him out for attention. While his eldest sisters may have known the domestic and financial difficulties of their parents, Gopal was born when his father, who was Joe the fifth professor at Calcutta University. I discovered recently, looking through some papers, that in 1908, 1909, 1910, in those years, Radhakrishnan lived in an area called Komalishwarpet, which is behind the great mosque near the Hindu office on Mount Road. Those were not particularly salubrious surroundings to grow up in, but Gopal, as I said, was born when his father was holding a name chair in Calcutta University. One must also note that the differences between Gopal's start in life and that of his father could hardly be more striking. Early photographs of Gopal, I'm sorry I've not been able to organize any photographs, but early photographs show a solemn little child, moon-faced, with even rounder spectacles, and hair slicked down, wearing a little coat and shorts. And for whatever reason, Gopal was very often formally photographed at studios. While at school in England, while at university, even later, photographs have found their way to the collection of his adoring sisters. Every generation lives in a time of transition, but the times in which Indians of Gopal's generation lived were more than usually turbulent. In Gopal's case, this was as true of his personal and professional situation as of political developments around him. As I mentioned earlier, Radhakrishnan's own origins were in genteel obscurity. And it is clear from hindsight that the family was caught between the need to remain conventional and respectable, while also faced with the possibilities of a wider world. The elder children of the family, all daughters, received a haphazard education and were married early, one at the age of 11. And all of them were married in the usual way into Andhra families better place than Radhakrishnan's own. Gopal is the youngest child, only son of a loving and upwardly mobile family, was sent to public school in England and later to Oxford. But he was still himself traditional enough to allow his parents to arrange a marriage for him in 1949 to Kaveri, always known as Indira in her husband's family, the daughter of Parvathamma and H.P. Ramaswamy of Mysore. Gopal's schooling in England was interrupted by the war, and he returned to England and Oxford after his first degree from Presidency College, Madras. This was in the early 40s, and I believe he took his MA in 1943. After a brief spell at Voltaire as a young lecturer in Andhra University, he returned to Oxford for his DPhil, to be followed by many years at the Ministry of External Affairs, St. Anthony's College, Oxford, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. India and England and India, this was the axis on which Sarvepalli Gopal constantly moved, with Madras, as it was for most of his life, providing a lifelong shelter. It is a truism to remark that Indians growing in the first half of the 20th century did so in the shadow of Gandhi. To a greater or lesser extent, they were influenced by him, and even those who did not follow his political, economic, or social thinking had to define themselves by their opposition to him. Jawaharlal Nehru was Gopal's hero. He says as much in his introduction to the 3-volume biography. But it is possible that even he regarded Gandhi always as the greater man. Writing in December 1947, a month before the assassination, Nehru says, this is now a completely forgotten book, but Nehru's introduction to this book, as I said, written before the assassination, he says, it is difficult to appreciate that mighty surge of feeling which shook India when Gandhiji first blew his trumpet of non-violence and non-cooperation. Much has happened since then, and we have seen many ups and downs. But with every crisis in our history, when lesser men have often failed, Gandhiji has risen a step higher. Not only in the affections of his countrymen, but also in the deep regard for his greatness. Truly, this has been a Gandhi era, and all of us who have lived through it bear some impress of it. India is changing and will change, as it must. But in ages to come, it will still remember and be influenced by the teachings of this great son. And not only India, but the world will realize more and more the essential truth and effectiveness of his message, which is essentially the message of India. This would have been, it was Nehru who said this, but this sums perfectly Gopal's own view always on what and where and how he regarded Gandhi. Sarvepalli Gopal is today probably best remembered, where he is remembered, for his 3-volume biography of Nehru. However, his work as a professional historian, which in effect spanned 50 years, covered 3 main themes: the study of empire, the struggle for independence and the growth of democracy, and the study of secularism. To this must be added his biographical work, for in addition to the life of Nehru, which was an officially commissioned work with the blessing of Indira Gandhi, there was also his single-volume life of his father, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, an intense and superbly written book, which the biographer and public intellectual Ramchandra Guha has called possibly Gopal's best work. Gopal's early historical training was in Presidency College, Madras, where the legendary Professor Franco held sway. Another important influence on him at this stage was Professor K. Swaminathan, later to become the first editor of the collected works of Gandhi. He also made some of his closest friends at this time, friends such as V. Abdullah and S. Rangaswamy, who later shared his years of retirement with him. His doctoral work in Oxford led to the publication of his book, The Viceroyalty of Lord Ripon, 1880 to 1884. This was not actually his first published work. That was The Permanent Settlement in Bengal and Its Results, a prize-winning undergraduate essay in Oxford. I don't suppose anyone reads The Permanent Settlement anymore, but I value the copy I have of this book, which he gave to my mother on her birthday with the lines, "This is my firstborn." And it was very neat. It was just a mark of the remarkable writing that N.Ram went on to do. It is no longer fashionable for the history of empire or for the history of any colonized country to be told from the point of view of the empire builders. But at the time that Gopal was building his reputation as a researcher, this was still the accepted view. He was a meticulous and diligent student of the archives and kept long and voluminous notes in longhand of the archival work put in at libraries in Oxford, London, and Cambridge. Ripon was followed by The Viceroyalty of Lord Irving, 1926 to 1931, a book which benefited from the fact that Irving and Radhakrishnan knew each other well, and that Gopal also had long meetings with Irving. Of this work, Srinath Raghavan writes, Irving is stamped with a combination of economy and elegance, the increasingly recognizable signature of Gopal's prose style. His work on British India came to an end with the magisterial British policy in India, 1858-1905, published in 1965. It is a work which is still essential reading for any student of the subject or the period. As I said earlier, this sort of historical research and writing is now considered old-fashioned at best and collaborationist at worst. A contemporary historian has noted, for instance, of Gopal's work, that his evaluation of colonialism was cautious, and nowhere in his work is there any serious interest in social or economic history or class analysis. And this critic goes on to contrast Gopal's work with that of several Bengali historians who, instead of focusing on imperial rulers, wrote a more broad-based social and economic history of India. This is a criticism which recurred, and it was criticism which will always need to be met. Gopal wrote a history of an earlier tradition, and it will also be recognized, and I've heard this said by several persons who were his students 20-25 years later in Jawaharlal Nehru University, that in the course of his lecturing on British India, his entire approach had changed somewhat to accommodate the point of view that was put forth by these critics, the so-called subaltern point of view, though it was not indeed the point of view that he wholeheartedly came to embrace. Gopal's life of Nehru drew greatly, not only from the complete access which he was given to Nehru's papers, a facility which has not been, to my information, granted to subsequent scholars, but also from his near daily meetings with the Prime Minister through most of the 1950s, when he was with the Historical Division of the Ministry of External Affairs, an office which probably does not exist anymore. It was in this capacity that Gopal became one of, if not the, leading authority within government on the issue of the border with China. In writing the biography, Gopal makes it clear that Nehru was his hero, the hero of his youth, and the hero of independent India. The first volume brings us up to independence, The second takes us to 1956 and Hungary and Suez. And the third covers the final years as Nehru was aging, confronted with the failures on the Chinese front, and an increasing awareness of what was still undone. There is considered to be more than Nehru volumes on social and economic developments in India than there was in the works on imperial policy. The Nehru biography, which has been recently reissued in its complete 3 volumes, continues to hold its own for the students of the man of his times, and despite the various other biographies of Nehru which have appeared since. It is not that Gopal's biography has not had its detractors. Critics have been quick to point out that Gopal had a tendency to idolize Nehru at the expense of his contemporaries. Thus, Rajaji, Bose, Rajendra Prasad, Azad, all come in for sharp put-downs, none of which may have been actually necessary, for all that they make very entertaining reading. There is also the criticism that in the 1,000 pages and 3 volumes, there is very little on Jawaharlal Nehru's personal life, very little on Kamala, and strangely even on India, which one would have thought would have been relevant given later events. The historian Sunil Kilvani puts it succinctly when he says, Edwina Mountbatten got all of one sentence, Padmaja Naidu not even that. Almost from the time of publication of these 3 volumes in 1975, 1979 and 1984, Gopal has been criticized for his devotion to the subject. To my mind, this is a point which can be debated. I cannot believe that a biographer can maintain any great distance from his subject. And in the particular case of Nehru and Gopal, I have no doubt that that distance was shortened by the charm, intelligence and nobility of the subject, and may I say also of the biographer. And in any case, the criticism that he was blind to Nehru's failures or shortcomings was completely set to rest by the Radhakrishnan biography. Published in 1989, Gopal's exquisitely written life of his father continues to set the bar for biographical writing anywhere in the world. It is a model of eloquence without extravagance and restraint without reticence. This is the son's book, he says in his introduction, going on to add that the relations between him and his father were much closer and over a much longer period than is any longer common. Yet, this did not prevent him from cautious objectivity in writing Radhakrishnan's personal and professional life. His thoroughness as researcher again came to the fore in the writing of this book, and I am aware that immediately after the publication of the 3rd and last volume of the Nehru biography, Gopal systematically began to read every line that Radhakrishnan wrote, starting from Essentials of Psychology in 1912 to Religion in a Changing World in 1967. This included 2 volumes of Indian philosophy, 2 volumes of the Principal Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutra, in addition to a host of other works. Radhakrishnan was a prolific writer and an even more expressive speaker, and as a diligent biographer, Gopal went back to all the primary sources. Towards the end of his professional life, Gopal played a larger role in public affairs than he had any other time in his career. He had indeed moved the resolution condemning the emergency at the Indian History Congress in Aligarh in 1975. And this is probably a good time to say this. Both father and son had a very ambiguous relationship with Mrs. Gandhi. To Radhakrishnan, she was always the bottom line was that she was a child of his friend. And in many ways, Mrs. Gandhi's metamorphosis as Prime Minister puzzled him. Because this was not the person he had known, this was not the person indeed of whom he was quite fond. In Gopal's own case, there was certainly a working relationship. She trusted him enough to allow him complete access to her father's papers in the course of writing the biography. But I think she was also aware that he thought very little of her capabilities. And the fact that he was the one who moved the resolution in Aligarh could not have endeared him at all to her. And I can recall just after the emergency, during the Janata rule, Gopal recounting to me an accidental meeting he had with her. She was no longer Prime Minister. And both parties were acutely embarrassed at this meeting. I don't believe he met her again after that, after she came back to power. In the early 1990s, Gopal edited a volume called Anatomy of a Confrontation on the various issues linked to the Babri Masjid and the Ram Mandir at Ayodhya. Gopal's generation came to adulthood in the 1940s and was witness to the horrors of partition. This was a generation which, as I have said repeatedly, that knew Gandhi and had to live with the senselessness of the assassination. The high secularism of the Nehru era, which was committed to a separation of the state from religion, was the dominant ethos through most of Gopal's adult life. But as Professor Raghavan has noted, Gopal, in his introduction to Anatomy of a Confrontation, writes, secularism is more than laws, concessions, and special considerations. It is a state of mind, almost an instinctive feeling, such as existed by and large for many centuries in India, when Hindus, Muslims, Christians, and Parsis, and followers of other faiths lived side by side in general harmony. I've called this talk, Sarvepalli Gopal, a life in his times. It is trite to say that each one of us lives in our own particular times, but it is true that Gopal's generation lived through extraordinary times. Access to higher education was still restricted by history, geography, ancestry, and income. But increasingly larger numbers of men, and also women, were at university. Madras, Calcutta, Lucknow, Agra, Allahabad, Bombay were prized centers of learning, as they are not possibly now. And for those lucky enough to receive a higher education, and Gopal was luckier than most, it was a good time to be alive. I've repeatedly spoken about Gandhi. And I think the other important point is that that generation was fortunate in its heroes. If Gandhi was the most extraordinary hero for that generation, there were other heroes. Nehru was a hero representing, as he did, the India of the future, and a future where India would display leadership. And to Gopal, his father, of course, was a hero. It would not have been difficult. It would have been difficult not to have been captivated by Radhakrishnan's intelligence and charm, or not to have been impressed by his qualities of self-confidence, diligence, and questioning curiosity. Gopal had other heroes. Christopher Hill, the Marxist historian, was one. And in fact, it should be remembered, especially by historians and academics of leftist persuasion, that Gopal was perhaps amongst the best read in leftist literature amongst historians of his generation. It was not a historical tradition he subscribed to or that he wrote within, but it was a tradition that he read and understood perfectly. And through his life, Christopher Hill, amongst others, was a great hero. Syed Mushtaq Ali and C.K. Naidu were others. And I should add here that if Gopal had any one passion in his life, it was cricket. We must also remember that that generation was fortunate in that they had no lack of potential candidates to be heroes. This was also the time of Tagore. This was also the time in public life of Bose. And for those who sought spiritual guidance, this was also the time of Sri Ramana, Sri Aurobindo, and Krishnamurti. It leads one to think that that generation was luckier, certainly luckier than ours, certainly luckier than the generation after ours, in the availability of heroes from which one could choose. And I think one should also say at this point that not only does every generation need to have its heroes, it needs to know how to choose them carefully. The early years post-independence were also a time of hope. Despite widespread poverty, despite low standards in education and public health, despite the lack of adequate opportunities for women, despite the crippling hold of caste, there was a sense of the future in which India had a great role to play. It is interesting to note that very many of Gopal's generation and of that immediately succeeding his, who went abroad to study, returned to India. It can of course be argued that this very small subset of Indians were in any case the most privileged and were then only too glad to return to their privileges. But that is a cynical view, and I would hold that the prospect of working in an independent and resurgent India would have been an important motivation for many of these people. Starting from the 1960s and the growth of what you might call the IIT generation, this has not been the case. And I would submit that the massive outmigration of the 1960s and the 1970s is a calamity from which we have not yet recovered. And it is a tribute to the earlier generations of that it gave back to India of its best. In his teaching life, Sarvepalli Gopal set the most exacting standards. To him, his university was always his first concern. And while he did not accept any of the vice chancellorships offered to him, he played a major role in setting up the Department of History of the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And over the years, whether at Oxford or Delhi, his students would speak of his very careful preparation for his lectures and of the demands that these made on the attention of his students. Never in his teaching career would Gopal have entered a classroom with the intention of winging it. Sarvepalli Gopal was also extraordinarily well read. And to my mind, this is also a generational thing. For someone who was not a full-time student of literature or the classics, his reading was extremely wide with a particular interest in contemporary fiction. Like many of his time, he was, as a child, trained to commit large chunks of poetry to memory. And I have a recollection of him towards the very end of his life, quoting from memory, verse after verse, of Elizabeth Barrett Brown's sonnets to Portuguese. I do not suppose this kind of training is any longer popular in schools. It was an extraordinary moment. He was talking about his parents and the relationship between them. And he began quoting and he said, the famous sonnet that begins, "How many ways do I love you?" Gopal, you will know this line. "Shall I count the ways? How many ways do I love you? Shall I count the ways?" And it goes on. But then he never stopped. He just went on and on, repeating sonnet after sonnet, huge chunks of poetry that were just in there somewhere from earliest childhood. This then was the man. Everything about him was entirely in keeping with his background and his upbringing. With the value system he drew from his heroes, and with the easy familiarity he had with the intellectual heritage of the English-speaking world. None of this would be considered relevant today. Indeed, liberalism in itself is under threat. The liberalism which marked both Gopal's understanding of history and his thinking on what made a civilized country. It is for this reason that it is more than ever important to recall his life and work as a person who, despite all indications to the contrary, believed to the very end in the future of India. Thank you. Is there any sample time of questions or?
Questions, anybody?
It was truly a gem of a talk, as Mr. Ram said. May I call upon Mr. Tilak Shankar, who knew Keshav very well, to deliver the vote of thanks. Mr. Tilak Shankar and Keshav worked together on the board of Cancer Institute as well. And may I request you to.
Good evening. Before I propose a formal vote of thanks, let me share a few personal reminiscences about Keshav. There are two parts to him that I will focus on. One, his professional contribution, in particular to healthcare, and his personal qualities. In both these areas, I found that I shared many common interests with him. Carnatic music, for example. Carnatic music used to be a regular at the Music Academy concert during the season, and he'll inevitably be in the last row. We'll be sitting one row ahead of him, and he can take 6 hours of continuous Carnatic music concert day throughout the season without getting bored or whatever. Subsequently, he wrote a brilliant book on MS Lakshmi, which Sujata also referred to. It is like typical of him, brilliantly researched. There are nearly 100 pages of references in his book on MS Lakshmi. It's amazing that he had gone into so much detail about MS Lakshmi as a person and about her music. I heard in another conversation that he could recall every single concert of MS Lakshmi he attended, every composition he remembered. I didn't see him noting down all the songs, but he knew everything. So he was an absolutely thorough professional, even when it came to enjoying Carnatic music. I am told from the family that he is working on a book on Saint Tyagaraja, for which he was learning Telugu, though he is a Telugu himself. The second aspect of his is the contribution to public health. Once again, he's written a very frank book on health, co-edited along with 2 others. In one of the tributes, Ms. Sujata Rao, who was a senior colleague at the Department of Health of India, talked about the work that he did for mental health. Not only the bill was passed, but he had worked on all the rules and regulations to make sure that the bill does not remain just a bill, it gets implemented. Similarly, on disability, he has done wonderful work. It was no surprise that a few days ago, there was a program of recollecting his work I didn't know that he was involved in a dozen plus Chennai-based NGO working on mental health and so on and so forth. Brilliant man. His stint in Uttarakhand, where he served for many years by choice, I believe even today, the people in Almora, where he spent a lot of time, are still grieving the sudden passing away of this wonderful man. I had an opportunity to work with him at the Cancer Institute, Adyar Cancer Institute, in the last few months. And he plunged into his work as if nothing else mattered. So he was involved in a dozen other organizations. Whenever I used to send a message saying, "Can I call you now?" He said, "Yeah, sure, sure." I was just doing some crossword or something like that. Obviously not true. So he was able to bring his brilliant understanding in helping the Adyar Cancer Institute. And we were working on something, and he said, "Let me do the drafting." It was absolutely brilliant. I have never come across in my 40 plus years of experience someone with such clarity articulating his ideas brilliantly. Who's the man about the person that Keshav was? Firstly, he never carried any chip on his shoulder. Unlike much lesser people who go about as if they've done everything in life. He was extremely humble. Nobody would know that he'd always be very simply dressed, and very good understanding of various issues. He was very, very good. If he did not know, he will want to know and learn the subject. Of course, his high level of integrity has been talked about all through his life. Even though it put him into a little bit of difficulty now and then, I think for him, what mattered was the values. So there are many, many things that the younger generation can learn. As Mr. Ram pointed out, he died without a fuss, but we were shocked to hear the sad news at such a young age, where he has lots more things to contribute. And every one of the institutions that he has worked on, including, I'm very happy to hear about his work with the INTACH, everything showed how people can make a difference, how a leader can make a difference to every aspect that they decide to work on. As Ramchandra Guha pointed out in an interview, we should celebrate his life. We should not mourn, we should celebrate his life, because he has achieved so much. I want to thank INTACH Chennai chapter for arranging this talk once again. And of course for Mr. N.Ram's brilliant articulation of not only Keshav but also Sarvapalli Gopal. We will all miss Keshav, and hopefully there is another Keshav somewhere hiding. We look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If anybody would like to say anything, please unmute yourselves.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course.
I think for those who are seriously interested in the writings of Sarvapalli Gopal as a historian, and also his other essays on quite a few subjects, we can provide a list, but as Keshav pointed out and Srinath Raghavan has dealt with in greater detail, he was a considerable biographer, and I think his his work on both Jawaharlal Nehru, these 3 volumes which are here, and this very distinguished biography of his father. I think, and Keshav, I think, imbibed the spirit. And when he spoke about Gopal, you would have noted that there's a certain intellectual distance, although he was very close. It's very hard to do it for somebody as close as they were, but he distanced himself sufficiently to do justice to Gopal's critics as a historian. And I think that that must really be appreciated. But the book that really is accessible and interesting and full of surprises, if in case you haven't read this, is this one, which the collector, the Imperialists, Nationalists, and Democrats, and it covers essays on interesting subjects, with as everyone recognized, a very fine introduction. There are also tributes to Gopal, in particular one by his student and later colleague Rudrangshu Mukherjee in the Telegraph. I have the date here. And also by Gopal's nephew M. Narasimham. That was published in Frontline around the same time, soon after Gopal died in 2002. So I think these things should be read and reread, and he was very productive. He wrote, yesterday, Sujata, I'm happy to report to you and to others who are interested, I looked for the first edition of The Permanent Settlement, which Gopal wrote. And I was delighted to find it in an English bookstore in amazon.co.uk for a reasonable price, something like 5,000 rupees, and I immediately bought it. That's the first edition, and I think you will discover valuable books like that, which Gopal wrote, and he wrote a number of essays. Modern India is another book. So I think Gopal's contribution as a historian is not very well known today to younger people, and it should be brought back to see how for those interested in historiography, how he evolved over the years as a historian, which is why I said that to regard him as the great Indian liberal historian is, I think, to do less than justice to how his approach to history evolved. But that's particularly for those who are interested in history. I read history myself, and at one time was enrolled in Gopal's department for a research degree, which I never completed, but I remember that. So I thought these things may be useful to those who want to follow Gopal's work. And his approach to biography has also drawn attention, I think, because biography used to be looked down by historians, but Gopal integrated biography as a part of it. And there are many other things that can be said about Gopal's approach to history. So I think this has to be brought to the fore, and I'm really grateful to INTACH, as many of us are, for discovering or rediscovering this little gem of a lecture. And if you can do a transcript and then have it edited and put out, I think that'll go even further, because it's a very fine lecture, talk, well-prepared talk, but easy flowing that Keshav Desiraju was able to give us. So thank you for rediscovering and putting out this little treasure, but you can do even more by doing a transcript.
We'll take that forward. We'll work on it.
Gandhi would like to say something. I see him there. It's a pleasure to say something.
No, I would just like to say that INTACH has brought S. Gopal and Keshav Desiraju alive in this session. And I'm most grateful to INTACH and to Sujata, Shankar, and Ram for having held it together so memorably and evocatively. I must say that the lecture by Keshav was nothing less than a revelation. I remember having attended it but hearing it again today has been something of a discovery, both about the subject, S. Gopal, but also about Keshav, and as Ram said, about the professionalism with which Keshav dealt with the subject objectively and also with an intimacy that was expected of this moment. I completely endorse Ram's suggestion that we would cherish the text of this lecture, for it is one thing to hear it in a recording and another to keep it for all time on one's shelves to turn to from time to time, especially in our present times, when the shallow has overtaken all depth and the passing show of tinsel has substituted the majesty of our country's history. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would anyone else like to speak? I see Mr. Veer Raghavan.
He's a man of few words.
Thank you, Mr. Ram, and thank you, Mr. Tilak Shankar. And thank you all for being here. And we'll definitely do the transcript and take your suggestions forward. And we hope Keshav's memory will live on. Thank you all so much and good night.